Okay, Alexander, let's talk about the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum 2021. And during that, the St. Petersburg Forum, it's customary for Putin to sit down with the international press. And you always get interesting sound bits from the discussion with the international press. Of course, they're trying to hit at Putin and trying to pull a fast one over him, and he's always dodging their bullets very easily, to be quite honest. I mean, I think you can see the difference of intelligence when you look at the international press compared to Putin. But anyway, he made an interesting comment during this exchange where he compared the U.S. to the USSR. Get into this. Maybe you may want to read exactly what he said as well. But it's a very interesting comment, given everything that's happening in the U.S. as well.
I will read it, but can I just say, first of all, it's the first time to my knowledge that he's actually compared the US to the USSR. And it's the first time also to my knowledge where he said that, like the Soviet Union, like the USSR, the US had become an empire. And what he said is this: I will tell you, as a citizen of the former Soviet Union, what is the problem with an empire. They think they are so mighty they can afford minor faults and mistakes. It is all okay. We will buy people and scare other people. We will reach an agreement with still others, give beads to those and threaten others with our warships. Problem solved. But problems pile up, and there comes a time when it is no longer possible to cope with them all. And the United States is firmly and steadily following in the footsteps of the Soviet Union. That's what he said. That's on the Kremlin's website. So it was quite an interesting comment, and it was related specifically to a discussion about the reserve status of the dollar, in which he was asked about whether or not more and more countries opting out of the dollar would, in the end, undermine its position as a reserve currency. And what Putin said was that he had no particular desire to see the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency end. That was not his wish or desire, but US policies, by sanctioning people left, right and centre, were creating that situation. But when you read the entire article, rather the whole exchanges that he had with the media, it's clear that he wasn't just thinking about the dollar. He was thinking about US foreign policy, which, of course, we've discussed many times on our programs, and you can see what he says there about threatening warships, bribing people, intimidating others, scaring some, persuading a few, that sort of thing. But he was also clearly thinking about US domestic policies as well, US economic policies and US social policies, which he thinks increasingly are mirroring those of the former USSR. And he clearly thinks that the United States is becoming or transforming itself, like the Soviet Union was, into an increasingly ideological state. That's what he really, I think, means when he talks about it being an empire, and the result is going to be bad, just as it was for the Soviet Union.
Is the US becoming like the USSR?
I think it's starting to have some of its features. I mean, there are a lot of things that are still different. I mean, the US still has private enterprise. I mean, still a lot of it. The Soviet Union, to all intents and purposes, had none. I mean, the US had a convertible currency, which is, of course, the world's reserve currency. The Soviet Union didn't. But there are far too many things, to my mind, which are starting to resemble each other. Well, the two countries are starting to resemble each other. We've seen the legal system, for example, in the United States being used, as it was in the Soviet Union, for political purposes. We see increasing signs of restriction on freedom of speech and exchange of ideas. We've seen people being bracketed as social groups. I'm going to be very careful what I say here, but we all know about the identity culture issues, which have been used in the US, which are being used in the US, and they have some uncomfortable resemblances to the way in which the USSR divided up people into class categories. And of course, we also see the US, rather like the Soviet Union, pursuing increasingly coercive foreign policy, one with some kind of messianic goal, which of course the Soviet Union also did in its heyday. So you could see increasing amounts of similarities, and that's, I think, what Putin is referring to.
How does big tech, you think, play into the statement that the U.S. is becoming like the USSR? What kind of role do you think the internet and technology and big tech plays? Obviously, in the USSR, you didn't have such things, but you did have that the constant. I don't want to say joking around, but there was always the sense that, you know, if I'm in Moscow and during the time of the USSR and I'm staying in a hotel room, you know, I'm sure it's bugged or I'm sure it's being surveilled, right? There was always that constant talk about that stuff. But obviously, we have a different world today, and big tech is, to me, is very much like the USSR kind of surveillance state, the KGB of its day. You don't have the bugs maybe underneath your table, but you know, you have the Facebooks and the Zuckbots and the Dorseys.
Well, absolutely. I think, you know, when I came back to the point about freedom of speech and freedom of ideas and freedom of exchange of ideas, I think that's exactly a parallel which Putin fully has in mind. Again, you need to look at the entirety of his comments over the course of a very long series of exchanges with the heads of the international media agencies. But he's absolutely fully thinking of this when he talks about this in this particular comment. And big tech plays a huge role, because big tech provides opportunities for surveillance, which have never existed before. I mean, the Soviets would have been delighted to have the kind of instruments that big tech provides, you know, the power, if you like, within the United States with. I mean, you can track what people do. You can obtain information about them. You can, of course, to an extraordinary extent now, listen into what they say. I mean, this is what, you know, the NSA does. It's being done with a degree of sophistication and a pervasiveness which the Soviet Union, in its pomp, could never achieve. I mean, bear in mind, the Soviet Union was a country where most people didn't have telephones. So there was little chance of, you know, listening into people's conversations on the phone, because that didn't happen. And of course, you could plant bugs in all sorts of places, but, you know, there's a limit to how much you can do that. You can't do things to anything like the kind of extent that we're seeing happening in the US now. So, I mean, that's I am sure that's something that Putin has in mind. And perhaps at this point, a necessary observation to make here is that, of course, you know, people talk about China, and I'm not going to dispute China does all these things on a far more pervasive and far more systematic scale than the US does. But it's important to say, and, you know, we've both been there, you've lived there, you've lived in Russia. This happens much less in Russia at the moment than it does in the US. So, you know, in a curious kind of way, the two countries are reversing position. And in Russia at the moment, it's possible to speak out and say things and get things published, which in the US you wouldn't be able to do. And you can say things which are very critical of the government, again, a point which Putin made, and very harshly critical of the government, using language which, if you were to use in the US, would today get you into serious trouble.
Yeah, but I would like you to move beyond, say, the freedom of speech part, because I think it's broadened out now. And I want you to talk about how big tech is actually working with, say, the intelligence services, the FBI's, the DOJ's, in order to actually now either, and I'll say either, lock down the country and cause businesses to fail, or to actually imprison people. And I'll give you two very specific examples. In the case of lockdowns, we have Facebook, and we have the records now. We have Facebook in communication with Fauci. And there, even Ted Cruz, I don't trust Ted Cruz when he says he's going to go after them, but even Ted Cruz is saying that the fact that Facebook was in communication with Fauci means that you have a big tech company in a monopoly position leveraging an employee of the government in order to create policy in both ways, Fauci using Facebook and Facebook using Fauci. So you have that scenario where you actually have big tech and government officials affecting lives and the liveliness of people, if their businesses are going to stay open, if their kids are going to go to school, etc. And then you also have the case where big tech, say, is working with the FBI, and I'll take the January 6th incident, where they identify people, they give their records of people that were involved in January 6th, and those people are put in prison, in this case in a DC prison. They haven't been charged with anything more than trespassing, and they're still there, many of them in solitary confinement, and no one really knows what's going on with these people. And the reason I bring up January 6th because Lavrov basically mentioned it too. That's why I bring it up, because Lavrov said that this is a human rights violation, and I'm sure that Putin may have taken some of those statements from Lavrov and broadened it out into this U.S. is becoming USSR thing. That's why I bring up that scenario.
Oh yeah.
So it is getting more than just freedom of speech, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, can I just say quickly on the January 6th issue, the Russians have made it very clear that if Biden brings up human rights issues with Putin, then Putin will bring up human rights issues with Biden, and that one of those will be the January 6th events. So, I mean, that's already been clearly signposted. But, you're absolutely right about the overall generality. And actually, I do take what Ted Cruz says very seriously. It's important to remember Ted Cruz, you may not think much of him politically as a politician, but as a lawyer, as a jurist, he is an extremely able lawyer. I mean, he worked for Antonin Scalia. He is somebody who could probably fill a Supreme Court justice position. And when he makes the point that what you're actually seeing with the Fauci emails with Zuckerberg is proof that social media works hand in glove with agencies of the government, including the government's security agencies, then he's absolutely right. And that goes directly to the point about whether or not these companies are truly private companies, as we're always being told. In Britain, at least, we have this point about companies that they may be private, but they may be serving a public or state function and should therefore be treated as emanations of the state and therefore subject to judicial review and accountability by the courts as if they were as if they were parts of the state. And I think that's exactly the point that Ted Cruz is making about these companies. They are actually acting on behalf of the state. They're working very closely with intelligence agencies and security agencies of the United States. They're working so closely with those agencies that they are, even though they purport to be private companies, operating as agencies of the state on behalf of the state and should be held accountable to the state in the same way. Now, the reason that is important, and sorry to go into a sort of slight tangent here, but I think this is an important point, is that, of course, if they are agencies of the state, then they fall directly under the scope of the First Amendment of the Constitution, which says that Congress cannot pass laws which abridge freedom of the speech or of the media. So if that is true, if that's what they are, if they are acting as agents of the state and they fall within the scope of the First Amendment of the Constitution, that many of the steps that they've been taking over the last couple of years to remove people from sites and do all those sort of things, they become illegal because they are unconstitutional as First Amendment violations. So that's Ted Cruz's argument. But going back to what Putin said, obviously he is looking. Remember, he was, he worked for the KGB, not by the way in its internal security division, but it's in foreign spying division. But he is familiar with all these things. He looks at the way in which surveillance is being conducted in the United States today, and not just in the United States, in all Western countries. And he sees that you have agencies, private companies, so-called, acting both in connection, in association with intelligence and security agencies to survey and gather information and data about people, and to provide them to law enforcement agencies so that people can be prosecuted, which is, of course, what surveillance agencies do. But at the same time, they're acting as censors and on behalf of the state also. And that's his point. That's one of the points he's making when he's talking about the USSR.
Okay, final question and comment. And I want to go back to the point where you made that Putin, I guess you could say that Putin is an expert when it comes to foreign surveillance and his role at the KGB. So I'm sure he understands foreign surveillance really well. And it's no secret that the USSR did a lot of foreign surveillance and probably a lot of foreign surveillance in the satellite countries of the USSR as well, in say the Warsaw Pact countries as well. Isn't it interesting how the U.S., and we're a week and change away from a meeting between Putin and Biden, how the U.S. is hitting at Russia on the cyber crime, cyber ransomware issue. Blinken's come out with some statements, and we'll do a video on this as well. They're hitting Russia with that, and they're trying to tie, allegedly, private actors who may be Russian to the state. And we really don't know yet, but this dark side group, I don't even know who they are. No one is really getting much information about them. But they're trying to tie private hackers to the state, right? And it did a lot of this during Russiagate as well. While it looks like Putin, to me, is trying to tie private companies, supposedly private companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter, and to say that they're part of the surveillance state of the U.S. And I think he's putting up a red alarm by saying that not only are these private companies working with the government to, say, imprison people on January 6th against human rights and so forth, but they're also acting on an international level to create all kinds of mischief, regime change, and color revolutions. It's no secret that Russia is having its difficulties with big tech, and they've said that they're going to move against Twitter. They're going to do something against Twitter because of various disputes they have. We had just a few days ago Twitter suspending the account of the Nigerian President Buhari. And whether you agree with what he said or he didn't, they did suspend, once again, a president. This is the second time they suspended Trump. Now they suspended Buhari. Actually, they also did some stuff to the Ugandan during the Uganda elections as well. Buhari then moved against Twitter, and he blocked them. So could you also make the argument that while the U.S. is trying to get Russia on cybercrime and ransomware, Putin is making the case that, yes, you guys are not only acting like the USSR did internally with what you're doing, but externally, you're using big tech and much of what, say, the Soviet Union would have done back in the day to influence countries, maybe instigate a regime change or two, and surveil countries as well. But you're not doing it through maybe the CIA as much, but maybe you're doing it more through big tech now and through these social media companies. I don't know, just a thought as to maybe some points that Putin was trying to get across.
It's indisputable that that's one of the things he's trying to make across. Again, you have to read the entirety of this, many hours long discussion that he had with the international media agencies, and you also need to be aware of the general debate and discussion that's been going on in Russia about the work of the social media and big tech companies in the US. And by the way, just to add, that it's not just in Russia that people are flagging these concerns. They've been flagged in Europe. I mean, there have even been articles and editorials about this in the British media too. So, undoubtedly Putin is bringing up these stories. And there's no doubt at all that if Biden does indeed try to bring up cyber attacks by Russian criminals in the US, Putin will respond and say, well, look at your big tech companies. They're acting on your behalf, not just to censor and to people, but to manipulate opinion, to instigate color revolutions in various countries, including my own country. So what you are complaining about, which is something which we as a state are not involved in. We can't be responsible for what every criminal in our country does. What you are complaining about is far exceeded in in scale by what you are doing, and you are doing it through the agencies of these companies. Increasingly it's becoming clear that this summit meeting that's going to happen in 10 days' time is going to be two people talking past each other, because Biden is going to come with a shopping list of things he wants to say to Putin, and Putin is going to respond in kind. It's not even clear that they're going to hold a press conference afterwards. I mean, it's already looking increasingly like it's going to be a shambles. The perhaps best resemblance is with the Khrushchev-Kennedy summit, which took place in 1961, when Kennedy came to meet Khrushchev just after he became president, and also came along intending to read a lecture to Khrushchev, only he got a lecture back. And that's exactly how the summit is going. It's going to be a complete shambles, with Biden bringing up topics like hackers and Putin responding in kind.
Yeah, hackers against big tech. There you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, of course, there's no evidence about the hackers. There's no actual evidence linking the hackers to the Russian government. Whereas, as we said, with big tech, there is, all you have to do is read what Ted Cruz had to say.
Exactly. Read the Fauci emails, and you understand there is some sort of connection between government and big tech. At least if you look at the from the health perspective side, from the health policy side of things, there seems to be an obvious interest with big tech and Fauci and the health policy of the United States, and that affects the world.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to stress, I'm not a huge fan of Ted Cruz, the politician, but Ted Cruz, the lawyer, looks to me like he's building a case, and that's probably coming some way down the road. But he's got a significant bit of evidence now that points in a direction which is, I think, one that he's working towards. So, don't overlook that comment. I think it's a serious one.
All right, we'll leave it there. Guys, look for us on Odyssey, on BitChute, on SuperU, and also Locals. Check us out on Locals as well. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off all merch. Use the code REALNEWS. Take care.